We can set off on these zero cycles, which I called cycle zero in my history of the century to come. I think today, and you'll understand this if you've seen what I'm showing you on the screen, what Guillaume is very kindly showing you on the screen, and which I've mentioned in previous broadcasts, is this renowned chronology. This chronology rationalized on the basis of what historionomics teaches us, i.e., the division into ages, each of which, well, is marked by the complete course of trajectories that I've called A, B, C, D, E civilizations, and which in fact form an A, B, C, D, E system, which we see repeated each time. And so I had explained to you that Greece, Rome, etc. were all part of the same system. What we call classical antiquity, and up to the end of the Roman Empire, is in fact rather the Second Age. What we've been experiencing since the fall of the Roman Empire is the Third Age, and what I'm calling here cycle zero, but which should just as appropriately be called the First Age, i.e. the first occurrence. I'm simply going to retrace its duration, explain a little about what happened, and of course explain how it fits in with the descriptions we've already made together of all the major cycles, since we've seen them all in previous broadcasts. So now you're ready to understand it easily, i.e. how we find civilization A, how we find civilization B, civilization C, civilization D, civilization E, in this very distant era, since we're talking about a period that stretches from approximately 2,700 years BC to what I called the first systemic overhaul of the 11th century BC, which saw the disappearance of these civilizations, major unrest throughout the eastern Mediterranean basin, and which ultimately corresponds to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th, 6th century, with all its attendant upheavals and the recomposition of the historical and geographical landscape. So, we're going to start at the beginning, and it's rare for this expression to have such force, because we're really going to start at the beginning of civilization, i.e. the process at the origin of the civilization process, which is the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution, it begins, so it depends on the place. You can put it up, Guillaume, a small image, a simple illustration to see the societies living at that time, Age of Empires players. It will speak to them. You know, I make a lot of references to video games regularly. If you played the first Age of Empires, it mentioned the Minoans and Mycenaeans, and I think that's how I first learned of their existence, because these are little-known civilizations, but I'll come back to that. What is the Neolithic Revolution? Well, it's quite simply the transition, the gradual transition of mankind, or of a certain number of human populations, from the hunter-gatherer culture, which is in fact mankind's primitive culture, that of mankind emerging from animality. In fact, since animals are hunter-gatherers, they hunt and gather to eat. Primates are hunter-gatherers, they often gather more than they hunt. In short, this activity is the basic activity, i.e. the activity that does not master agriculture. So the Neolithic Revolution was the creation of agriculture, which had a whole host of extremely important effects, since the creation of agriculture was the corollary of sedentarization. Before that, populations were nomadic, which doesn't mean they necessarily migrated. They can be nomadic in a relatively defined territory, which is their hunting ground, and on which they regularly move, leaving vegetation and fauna to recover when they are absent, so that they can then return. So we're moving from this nomadic lifestyle to a sedentary one, because you have to be close to the crops, and while you can move the animals around, there are populations of shepherds who have been able to remain nomadic. The vegetation doesn't move around. So the first effect is sedentarization. Second effect, the need to live according to the cycle of the seasons, to plan, because from the moment you base your lifestyle on agriculture, you stop consuming from day to day, or practically, and you begin a life that is modeled on the growth and death of plants. And so you have to think in particular about making substantial provisions for winter. And to manage a stock that you obtain through cultivation at harvest time, for example, to get you through the periods when you have nothing left. At the same time as this sedentarizes populations, it leads them to set up a social organization that will enable them to live according to these kinds of constraints. It also allows communities to grow, since it provides resources that are relatively certain, with food that can be more stable. It protects populations from a whole host of dangers associated with nomadic life, in particular accidents, hunting, etc. So it reduces this, allowing human communities to grow. And also, from the moment you have agriculture, you increase the quantity of resources that a certain territory will yield. And so this too allows the accumulation of populations, and so will gradually take place. It's progressive, of course, but the urbanization of certain areas. Because as soon as you have food that can be stored, whose production is stable, you're in a position to supply large human populations. And you obviously have a natural selection that takes place according to the strength of the localities. So you have centers of power that appear, you have exchanges that begin, since not all terroirs supply exactly the same foodstuffs. So at first it's obviously not over very long distances, but at last, within a few kilometers, you could have exchanges, one place fruit, one place cereals. And I spoke to you when I did the program on the New Middle Ages about the importance of networks in the creation and emergence of civilization. So, quite simply, and I repeat, agriculture created civilization. It's from agriculture that civilization is born, which is why the starting point of civilization is this Neolithic agricultural revolution. So this Neolithic revolution begins, so the places where it begins the earliest, we think, would possibly be in Melanesia, around the 11th century BC. In sub-Saharan Africa, it would begin the latest. In the 12th century BC, but generally in the Fertile Crescent between the 19th and 7th centuries BC, these are the most important developments. You have the Indus Valley civilizations that appear. The centers, the last ones discovered, I believe, are at Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, and so that's the first real process. Before this Neolithic revolution, there's no civilization, there can't be any, because you can't have civilization, i.e. the appearance of cities, quite simply, that's civilization. Clivuitas in Latin is the city. You can't have civilization if you don't have agriculture, so agriculture is the starting point. And what we're going to talk about tonight is this first age, the first occurrence of these historionomic cycles I'm talking about, which emerges after the first leap, which is the appearance of civilization, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. And it starts, so I could say that it starts earlier, because you have civilizations that start very early. The Egyptian civilization, for example, you know that it was already at its first apogee at the time when the Cretan civilization we're going to talk about, the Minoan civilization, was just emerging, i.e. by the time the Minoan civilization was just starting to establish itself in Crete, you already had the pyramid of Djoser that had been built in Egypt, so the Egyptian empire was already well established. However, as you know, an ABCDE cycle begins with civilization A, so we're going to start with the equivalent of civilization A in very ancient times, which was Crete. So, before I explain a little about the difficulties of this exercise, if I originally spoke of cycle 0 in the history of the coming century, it was because necessarily the parallels are less clear-cut than for Greece and Rome, for example. But why? Quite simply because to be able to draw the great civilizational parallels that I do, you need to have not only archaeological data, things that show you the overall evolution of the civilization, but you also need to have a framework, a narrative within this civilization, i.e. to know when people started to do this, what the regime was like, the institutions, etc. And the problem with very ancient civilizations is that they are not all the same. And the problem of very ancient civilizations, Crete and Mycenaean, etc., is the language barrier. Often the language barrier, and above all the writing barrier, because these are civilizations that contributed few texts, And the texts we do manage to have, either we don't manage to decipher them like the so-called Linear A in Crete, or we manage to decipher them like the Hittite tablets, like the hieroglyphs, like the Mycenaean Linear B, which is in fact Greek in an older version. And in these cases, despite everything, the literature we have is a literature. We have some diplomatic documents, correspondence. We have a lot of accounting documents, but we don't have many stories. On the other hand, given that there was less of this habit in the regions of Crete and Mycenae, especially since many things have been destroyed, I'll explain why later. But if you like, we lack these stories, and then in general we lack political discussions, for example. For example, you don't have Mycenaean philosophers or people like Aristotle, who wrote a whole series of documents on the constitution of Carthage, the constitution of Sparta, the constitution of Athens, which give us extremely valuable information on institutions and their evolution, even if there's a world, if you like. My camera is definitely having problems this evening, even if there's a world between what we know about political evolution in Europe, for example, and what we know about political evolution in Greece, because a whole host of documents have disappeared, but also because, for reasons of size and demography, etc., Europe has produced infinitely more writings than Greece, and so in Europe we have almost too many texts to be able to synthesize everything. In Greece, on the other hand, we're forced to guess at a certain number of things, in particular in the writings of Aristotle, for example. There's a whole literature of antiquizitors who have thought about what Aristotle said, what is current, what he recomposed, where he made mistakes, where he made mistakes, where he made mistakes, where he made mistakes. He may have made mistakes in trying to reconcile contrary opinions, when in reality they were irreconcilable, yes, all that kind of effort. But at least we have this material, so we can at least discuss it, whereas when it comes to very early antiquity, we essentially have archaeological work that allows us to, from which we often deduce social structures by seeing, for example, that there was a large palace in the middle of such agglomerations. So we'll say that it was more likely a monarchy. We'll try to draw a parallel with societies at the same level of development, but which we know better to say that it must have been a priest-king, etc. You see, but this makes it difficult to deduce the social structure of the area. You see, but this means that we're often very short of stories. We don't have any stories, and if you don't have any stories, you're bound to be handicapped in making the history of something. You can make an economic and social history that's more or less reasonable, but it's hard to know what happened, in what order, etc. And so that's a handicap. And that's a handicap because in historionomics we work a lot on institutions, their evolution, the evolution of debates within society, social psychology, and if all you have is information on what people ate, how they built things, etc., it's a bit inadequate. However, the point is that, on the other hand, for Mycenaean antiquity, which comes after, which is civilization B, if you like, the equivalent of the Roman Empire and the American Empire, but in this very high antiquity, we have the whole Mycenaean story, and the people who built Mycenae, i.e. the Achaeans, Homer's famous Greeks, and this story is to be found in the Greek heroic myths. And what you're going to see when we talk about the history of the Achaeans is that in reality, Greek heroic myths are very historical. They tell us a great deal about what happened, and very often all we have to do is compare them with what archaeology tells us to realize that to a large extent, if not in detail of course, then in terms of the framework it provides, it tells us a great deal about this history. And what you'll see is that this framework of heroic myths confirmed by archaeology, well, it corresponds with that of more recent civilizations, notably civilization B, as far as Mycenae is concerned. So there you have it. To explain why this is so difficult and why I'm dealing with it separately beforehand, bearing in mind that we can't be as complex about the others. But the reason I'm talking to you about it, and why I've already mentioned it in my book, is because if we reconstruct things, we see that they fit together despite everything, and that we can clearly see a first age at that time. We'll start with an initial map showing the Eastern Mediterranean around 2700 BC. If you can display it for me, Guillaume. Here it is. Always that I went to find on this excellent site, Giacrone, which I recommend to you, which allows you to see the world year by year, the political state of the world. There are places where it could be refined, where it could be challenged, but it's still a pretty electrifying tool to work with. So you can see that Sumer's civilization was already well developed at that time. Egypt fully existed. It was an upper and lower Egyptian empire. There was no problem. And in Crete, the island in the Aegean Sea, the Minoan civilization is emerging. So why Minoan? Because that's simply what it was named by Evans, the archaeologist who discovered this civilization, in the same way that Schliemann rediscovered Troy. He discovered the Cretan civilization and gave it the name of the famous king of Crete, the one who had locked up the Minotaur, King Minos, and he gave this name to the so-called Minoan civilization. Minoan civilization. For a while it was thought that this civilization was the work of people who came from Anatolia around the time of 2700 BC, perhaps a little earlier, in 3000 BC, but in reality, the more things go, the more archaeologists think that it was really an indigenous civilization that developed on this island and on the other islands of the Aegean Sea. So it developed in the same way as a civilization always does. So first observation. If you could please show us the geography of Crete, Guillaume. First observation. The civilization appears where it's strongest. You've got the articulated orography, i.e., what allows you to be very focused on maritime trade, and the use of the sea as a means of communication, and what we call, what David Kozande, to whose work I'm referring, called Merupuri, i.e. the fact of allowing the appearance of stable political entities due to geography. And if you look at the island of Crete, in fact, within the Aegean, it's still probably the most jagged place in this sense, apart from the Aegean Islands. Aegean Islands. This area is relatively protected from all the empires of the time, from Egypt, from civilizations, from the Mitanni, which is a civilization that appeared in Syria at that time, and where a whole host of small autonomous entities were able to emerge. And if you look at the following map, you can see the main Cretan archaeological sites in red, and I've added yellow to show, and it's a bit of a squint, but it's quite clear, to show their natural geographical area of control. And we're still on the subject of what I'm saying. I refer you to the little video Guillaume edited on the construction of nation states, i.e. a city that spreads out, that appears on a fertile plain, which is the best place to accumulate power. And power comes from what? It comes from demography in these remote periods, so accumulating population and accumulating wealth. Wealth comes from the soil, it's agriculture, so it's there that urban nuclei are made, so it's there that power is born, which then imposes itself on peripheries that are more mountainous and less fertile, etc. And that's how urban nuclei are born. And so you see that the geography of Crete, just like the geography of Europe in its time, and of Greece in its own, is extremely favorable to the emergence of political entities of this kind on a space of equivalent size and on fairly stable spaces. And so it's probably, that's what happened. And that's what we call the Palatial civilization. So if you look, this civilization spread rapidly throughout the Aegean Sea, and you can see that all the islands of the Aegean Sea, the Cyclades in particular, were probably, if not colonized, at least attached to this group. And so this palatial civilization, here I've shown you the image of the palace of Knossos, which was probably the largest palace on Crete, and Knossos was probably the leading power on Crete. The site above is Knossos, the site below is called, I don't know what it's called, it's a little less important, but you can see that it was the one that reigned in the middle and which had the largest territorial base the largest territorial basin, and so we call it a palatial civilization. In fact, the ancestors of the cities, and which are perhaps even smaller in scale than the cities. Since these were administrative complexes where the king would reside, and there would be a few houses around, we're talking about settlements of a few thousand inhabitants at most, which is very, very few. You have to realize that the scale at that time was much smaller. If you look at the 15th century, the biggest military battle we know of, and which is probably one of the first great battles in military history, is the Battle of Megiddo between the pharaohs and the Canadian populations of Kadesh, I believe. It was, we estimate today, around 10,000 Egyptians, an army of 10,000 Egyptians against less than that, meaning that in total the belligerents must have numbered around 20,000. If you look at the battles, for example, the big battles of antiquity, that is the next age, the second age, we're talking about 10 times that, in other words, on the order of magnitude. So it's likely that, demographically speaking, the size of the cities was also an order of magnitude smaller. And so if you take Athens, which was the most populous city in Greece, and at its peak must have had 300,000 or 400,000 people, well, in what must have been the conurbation of Knossos, there must have been a maximum of 30,000 or 40,000 people, and in Knossos even a few thousand. So it's really a step down in the order of magnitude. But nonetheless, this palatial civilization meant that you had palaces that were centers of power and were the equivalent of city-states in ancient Greece. And here are a few of them, including the one at Knossos, the one at Malea, there was one called Massara, and there's one at Phaistos too. These are the great sites of Crete that I showed you just before. So there was a concentration of power in these centers, as in the model of national construction, which is quite typical of my videos, because at the beginning it was always the same thing. Yes, that's it, that's the principle, it's always the same thing at different times. So here I'm just showing you that the same thing happened in Crete, but there's no point in me dwelling on it for 3 hours. You've got it, a set of policies of relatively equivalent and stable entities that were probably at war with each other, but also traded with each other and underwent a movement of expansion towards the Cyclade and beyond, because in fact if you look at the map above...
Just before that we get a donation from the Montenegro account who says, "Great show as always, so many thanks to him, and LLG who says, "I find it hard to imagine political entities so small. If a Minoan decides to wander in one direction and walks more than 20 kilometers, he arrives at the enemy."
Well, yes, but that was still the case with the Greeks. If you look at a map, you'll know for a very long time. And if you look at a map, maybe you can find one for us, Guillaume, quickly on Google Maps. If you look at a map, for a very long time, Megara and Athens fought over the island of Salamis, because whoever held the island of Salamis held the Grand Large, in fact, held the road to the Grand Large, and he could block it for the other. And so for a long time there was a struggle between Megara and Athens over this. And Athens had lost the war the first time, had lost control of Salamis. It had been a real humiliation, and it was probably the Athenian aristocracy that was satisfied with this. Solon, the great Solon, made a name for himself by reciting a great epic poem for the revenger for the recapture of Salamis, which made him famous. So he was waging war for the island of Salamis. And the funny thing is that if you look between Athens and Megara, there's something, even today of course, something like 20 kilometers, I think. That is to say, it's something in 4 hours you could make the journey, except that it was an enmity equivalent to that which may have existed between France and Germany, for example, in the 19th century. We were on that order. So you see Megara on the left, you see it, it's here, Megara. I'm making a little circle with my mouse on it. Athens, you see it. Well, it's huge, of course, since Athens has been growing for 2,000 years. But you have to see it was at the level of the Acropolis at the base, in the middle of the island of Salamis, so it's two powers that were fighting over it. And you've got about 20 kilometers between the two. So that doesn't prevent us if you like, from talking about population scales that are very much smaller, and also about dimensions that are very much smaller. And it's true that it's very interesting to see that there's a change in scale from age to age, but that the relationships that change in scale, on the other hand, are very much the same. We're capable of hating the German, the Boche, in 19th century France, in the same way as we hated the Megaric type in Athens, except that he was 20 kilometers away instead of 500 kilometers when we were Parisians and when we were Germans, and so on. So you see, yes, I know it sounds strange, but that's also how it works. And even on an even smaller scale, you have tribes that can hate each other in remote corners, and it's something that hasn't even disappeared, even in the bigger states. If you look at the famous village quarrels, the stories of the blackbird bells, we call them steeple quarrels, they simply still exist. In the days when political entities were at city level, the quarrels of steeples simply led to wars. I think I've answered that question. So let's carry on. Let's remember the next one, the era of Minoan influence. That's it. That's what's interesting. The Minoan civilization had a virtually direct hold on the Cyclades. So you had islands that were populated by the same people as the Cretans. Santorini was a powerful island where there was a very strong Minoan city, probably a palace in itself, and which was completely destroyed. Why? Because the island was a volcano that exploded, but really exploded. The volcano exploded. I think it was said that the shockwave went 3 times around the Earth. A huge thing. And it made a tidal wave, by the way, that destroyed part of the northern ridge. I think it's one of these, I think it's this one right here. The one that's furthest north, furthest in the middle, sorry, just perpendicular to Knossos. If you look, you'll see an alignment of 3 islands, and that would be the one in the middle. But the Minoan civilization went beyond that. Ceramics, pottery, probably made in the Cretan style, have been found all around Anatolia, all along the coast of the Peloponnese and Attic, and Euboea, as well as on the Sicilian coast. And so we're pretty sure that this was part of the era of influence of the Cretan civilization, at least, simply because even if there weren't necessarily any settlements, then there were probably trading posts. Even if there wasn't any Minoan military occupation in these places, well, as these lands were civilizationally, were very backward compared to the Cretan civilization. We simply think that they were in a tributary relationship with the colonials, in the same way that the Gauls in the hinterland ditched against the Greeks in the 5th century BC, or things like that. You see, we were in that relationship. So the phase of the colonial empire that also marks the civilization at its apogee probably existed on the island of Crete. What's more, it was a technologically advanced civilization, since there were sewage systems, which we found at Akrotiri, the excavation site on the island of Santorini. And we discovered that the Cretans had a sewage system, so in terms of urban planning, they had already achieved a certain degree of advanced civilization, which would then reappear in Roman times. So you'll note that the Minoan influence extended all the way to Crete, and this is extremely interesting in continental Greece. Sorry, and why is this extremely interesting? Because, as you know, a civilization B is born in the colonial space of civilization A, on which it initially depends, before breaking away and dominating it in its turn. But what you're about to see is that this is exactly the relationship. The Cretan civilization was to the Minoan civilization. Could you please show us what the world looked like in 1500 BC, Guillaume? From 1500 BC onwards, you can see. We estimate that there was relatively solid. In continental Greece, it was partly dependent on Greece. There are traces of this in the Greek myths, because if you take the famous story of the Minotaur, which I mentioned earlier, what is the story of the Minotaur? It's about King Minos of Crete, who asks Theseus of Athens to send him slaves. That's right, I think it's 7 boys and 7 girls from memory every year. And so there's the trace, which means that Greek culture has kept a trace in its mythology of... So here I'm making an incision here to clarify, because it's important to understand how it works. In Greek mythology, what we call Greek mythology, there are 2 main groups. You have what might be called pure mythology, i.e. everything that corresponds to the heroes, the whole bestiary, the cosmogony in particular, i.e. the appearance of the universe, Chronos, etc. And you have what is called the mythology of the universe, i.e. everything that corresponds to the heroes. And you have what we call heroic myths, or at least what I call heroic myths, so that it's clear to me, i.e. those that concern the action of heroes that describe historical events, or are intended to describe historical events. Because the myth, the story of this kind, in fact the heroic story, quite simply, is the first stage in the writing of history. I think I've already explained to you, or I don't remember which program, the fact that, if I think I explained it to you in Salt on Civilization, that there are phases in the writing of history, depending on the intellectual development of the population and its historical development. The most evolved phase, the one we're in today, is quantitative history, where we look for the great forces that appear behind the foam of historical facts. And the most primitive way of telling history is precisely through stories of heroes, heroic narratives, which enable us to give plots and origins directly, however vague, however hazy. The chroniclers of the Middle Ages, for example, wrote above all about heroes. They told epics, and that gives historians a lot of historical clues, but it only gives clues about institutions, the way things worked and all that, because it's pretty primitive. It's not intellectually very elaborate as history. So myths allow you to tell things like that. And if you're in a civilization with an oral culture, for example, it's not easy to keep an exact list of the kings of France, for example, with the start and end dates of their reigns, and to explain everything they did. So if we were in a primitive culture and wanted to pass on a minimum of information, we'd probably make a kind of genealogy: Clovis, Charlemagne, Philippe le Bel, Henri IV, for example, and maybe we'd even get it wrong and explain that Charlemagne was the son of Clovis, that Charlemagne is the father of Saint Louis, for example, himself the father of Louis XIV, you see. Well, that wouldn't make any sense when you know the facts, but it would provide a primitive framework that wouldn't be false. Understand, that's what's important. It wouldn't be false in the absolute. It would be distorted, so we wouldn't be able to believe it in detail. We wouldn't be able to believe in particular that the relationships of filiation are exactly those. We wouldn't be able to believe the dating either, because that would sum it all up in 200 years, whereas instead of 1,000 or 1,500 years, but on the trajectory we'd have something, right? So what I'm looking for, what we should be looking for when we study heroic myths, is not to know exactly the story of Theseus, the Minotaur, etc. That's not what's important. What's important is to know what the subtext is, i.e. what it evokes and what we can see in the archaeology. Well, what we've seen in archaeology, as I've shown you, is that the whole of the Mycenaean coast, the whole of the Greek coast, was in what we might call the Minoan colonial area. Its air of influence from this civilization that was shining at the time. And what the texts tell us is that there was a relationship of subjection. And Crete, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that there was a rebellion movement by these Greek populations against Crete, because that's the whole story of Theseus. Moreover, in his story, Theseus, after paying, it seems to me, would have to embark on expeditions afterwards. So you see, there's this aspect of the inversion and subjection of Crete by the Achaeans. That's quite clear. So let's go back a little, because just before, yes,
Right. We have a gift from Will Schrödinger, so thank you very much to him, who says, when are historiognomy universities coming up? And we have a question from Tonton Didier, who says, can Mr. Fabry give us a little summary of the history of Atlantis? I'm intrigued.
So when can we expect the universities of histonomy as soon as possible? We're working on it. I hope it'll happen, but I think it'll take a little while yet. The history of Atlantis, so not my soft spot on this one, but just to remind you, Atlantis is a myth that comes from two texts by Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias, which are philosophical narratives, always the same for discussing vice and political virtue, etc., and who explain that they got the story about this island Atlantis from Solon, the Greek sage, who himself got it from a priest of the city of Sais in Egypt, that is to say, from an Egyptian, who explained it to him in a temple. It was written on the walls of a temple that has never been found by archaeology, this story of Atlantis, which was a great island ruled by 10 kings who set out to destroy it. Plato's idea was to evoke political degeneration, the hubris of expansionism, etc., which he denounced in a number of his works, notably in the Republic, because we know that Plato was in favor of withdrawal, of closing borders, etc., and explains that these Atlanteans would have attacked Athens and that they would have been defeated there would have been great earthquakes which would have killed a certain number of memories in Athens. And then he says, so the translated memory text, the famous one, which is always quoted, is that in the space of a single day and a single fatal night, Atlantis was engulfed in the waves. So, of course, we've always been looking for Atlantis, which is supposed to be beyond the doves of Hercules and so on. It's hard to sort out. But what's really interesting is that the island of... It's hard to sort out, but what's very interesting is that the island of... It actually corresponds quite well to the history of the island of Santorini, since we know that the Egyptians were very familiar with Crete, which was called Keftu, and I think we see it called Kaftor in the Bible too, with which the Egyptians traded a great deal. And so when the island of Santorini exploded, and there was a terrible tidal wave that destroyed a whole part of the northern Cretan coast, it was the big cataclysm, the big natural disaster of the time. And so it's likely that the Egyptians, by canvassing, heard that indeed there was a whole prosperous island that had disappeared, and that this had dealt a blow to Cretan power. And so it remained in the texts, and 1,000 years later, when Egyptian priests told Solon about it, there was an Arabic telephone side to it, since it came all the way back to Plato, and Plato himself probably changed the story a little to fit in with what he wanted to get across philosophically. What's interesting is that here too we see an element that explains that there was an invasion by these Atlanteans against Athens, so with the story of Theseus it makes sense. So presumably the story of Atlantis was in fact the Cretan civilization that suffered this cataclysm, and it probably dealt a blow. It didn't finish off the Cretan civilization, since we can see things rebuilding afterwards, but it was probably one of the elements that weakened it and then allowed the Mycenaeans to regain the ascendancy on the ridge. So this Atlantis story wasn't off topic, and it's very interesting, just as it won't be off topic later on when we talk about the Trojan War, simply because, in spite of everything, Plato's account of the Trojan War is far from first hand, unlike Homer's poems, which were already much closer to the date, so it was a little better. Plato is still 500 years after Homer, so it's already probably a lot more distorted. Plus, there are ideological presuppositions that change that, whereas Homer's aim was simply to tell a story. Well, it's not whether he existed personally or whether it was an oral tradition, whereas Plato's aim is to get a message across. So when you're getting a message across, you're bound to alter the story you're telling, whether unconsciously or not. But what's interesting is that we can still see that there was a tension, a struggle probably between the Achaeans of mainland Greece and the Cretan populations, who were expansionists, who were very powerful. And as we've seen, if we go back to this era of Minoan influence, it's still an excellent candidate for this Atlantean civilization, especially since it had been largely forgotten by Plato's time. The Cretan civilization was rather ignored because, unlike the Mycenaean civilization, the stories of Greece, we don't have stories internal to the population, to the history of Crete, if you like. We don't have stories of people who lived on Knossos who did this and that. We do have tales of Achaean heroes, but quite simply because the Achaeans lived on the Greek mainland and the Greek populations of classical Greece, those who brought us the texts, the poets for them, were their Achaean ancestors. So they knew these stories, but they didn't know the stories of the Cretans, so we don't have any internal accounts of Cretan life. So we do have a few traces, notably in the legends of King Minos and the Minotaur. It's always fun to read the lives of illustrious men later on. If you read the life of Theseus, you'll realize later on that he had a very critical vision of history. Critical in the intellectual sense, i.e. he didn't recount myths, he didn't repeat myths, i.e. he wondered where the legend of the Minotaur could have come from. He didn't believe in the legend of the Minotaur at all, but he said it might have been a general called Taurus or something like that who must have had a palace in Crete, since we know that bulls were important in Crete. I don't know what they're called, these cow races that are held in certain Spanish towns. There were games like that. If you look at the illustrations, some of the illustrations of reconstructions of life among the Minoans, you'll probably see guys like that doing acrobatics with a bull, which were probably some kind of games with a religious meaning too. A ritual around a bull cult that must have existed there. And you also know that Minos, there's a whole story around the bull. There's the Minotaur, who's one of his sons. There's Zeus, who kidnaps Europa, who I believe is also a daughter of King Minos. Even today, we still wonder whether Minos wasn't simply the term used to designate the king in the Cretan language, which, once again, we don't know. We can't decipher Linear B, the language of the Cretans, the Minoans. We don't know it. We know the language of the Mycenaeans because it was simply Greek, and the person who deciphered Linear B did so when he realized that it was written in Greek, and saw that Konosso, for example, was there and said, ah, well, that's Knossos, and that's how he came to the idea that it was Greek. For example, you have the word Wanaka, which gave rise to Anax in more recent Greek, which is the great king. So a whole bunch of terms like that. But for the Minoans, there aren't any, so we don't have any internal accounts. On the other hand, we do have accounts of the Achaeans, so we're going to go back a little bit in time to understand how this Mycenaean area came to be, which then spread out towards the Aegean Sea and the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. So we'll have to start from the beginning. Here too, Mycenaean civilization, so why is it called Mycenaean? And why is it also called Achaean? Well, the correct term is Achaean, centered on the city of Mycenae, which was probably its capital, and I'll show that later, but the name is Achaean, the name given in Homer's stories, and it was an Indo-European population of Indo-European language who had come down through the Balkans and settled on the Greek mainland, So, to give you an idea of what it looked like, here are a few Mycenaean sites. Here they are, the big Mycenaean sites. You see, they correspond to the map I showed you. This is where these Indo-Europeans settled. So they came down through the plains of Thessaly and settled mainly in the north of the Peloponnese, and particularly in Argolida, that is, around the city of Argos. And here's the first thing that's extremely important to understand. The heart of this Achaean civilization, and that's why it's called the Mycenaean civilization, is what I call the Argolid Triad, i.e. the three great cities that were located in the Argolid, which are somewhat equivalent to Rome and its periphery, if you like, in Rome and Italy, and the equivalent of New England in the United States, i.e. the Yankees, who created the civilization of the United States, a B civilization that still has one, and the heart of this Mycenaean civilization is this Argolid triad. So, quite simply, from a geographical point of view, it's the place where the populations were most concentrated, probably the richest place, but it's also very interesting because it's the place where the people were most concentrated, probably the richest place, but it's also very interesting because it's the place where the people were most concentrated. It's also very interesting because Greek heroic myths show that these three cities were extremely closely linked. So to give you a few examples I've listed from the history of the century to come, what we see is that Mycenae was probably the most powerful city, and that Tyrrhene and Argos were allies or vassals, but that we were in a kind of confederation of the three. So for example, Argos is linked to Mycenae, since at the start of the Trojan War, Argos confiscated Agamemnon, who was king of Mycenae and leader of the Achaeans. That's the first clue we have, because in the tradition of the Trojan War, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the Achaeans, gives the idea that Mycenae was the center of Achaean civilization. What's more, his title in the Iliad is Anaxanthropon, meaning the great king of men. All the other kings, Nestor is king of Pylos, Menelaus is king of Sparta, and so on. But their title is Basileus, i.e. it's the title that later became the title of king in classical Greece, but which in reality designates a local kingship, Basileus. And when we studied languages, archaeology if you like, we realized that Wanaka is the great king and Cassireus was a kind of count, in other words, a local magistrate who was either feudal e. There was a kind of fever, or designated by a central administration, the internal evolution of which I'll come to later. Finally, Agamemnon is never referred to as Basileus, but in the Iliad as Anaxanthropon, i.e. the great king. So it's not a fact that the leader of the coalition is Agamemnon, it's the king of Mycenae. And so, at the start of the Trojan War, he confiscates Argos from its king Diomedes because he didn't want to come to the war. And that's interesting because it brings us back to the idea that Diomedes, the king of Argos, was Agamemnon's vassal, a relationship of vassalage. Moreover, in the feudal system, there's a sanction called comice, which is the confiscation of a vassal's fief aricat de citron, lemon. Later, when Orestes, Agamemnon's son, is expelled from Mycenae for reasons of internal power struggle, he takes refuge in Argos, which is really the second city in relation to Mycenae. King Perseus, the founder of Mycenaean Greek myths, was, according to legend, the grandson of the king of Argos. So you see, we're still in this relationship. In other words, Perseus, who founded Mycenae, had two sons, Electrion, who became king of Mycenae after him, and Alce, who became king of Tyrrhene. And I'm pretty sure anyway, that Tyre was a vassal of Mycenae, because if you look at the myths again, you'll see that Heracles, who is the grandson of Alcaia, was the king of Tyre, obeys and is constantly assigned to various missions by Eurystheus, who was king of Mycenae. And so Heracles was probably the master of Tyrrhene. And so, if you like, you can see that the three cities are completely intertwined in the myths, and that's what really stands out, that this Argolid was truly the center of Mycenaean civilization. And it was this Mycenaean center that imposed itself on the whole of Greece. Archaeologists often say that we can't say whether Mycenae was a great center. Well, we can say that it was a major center, but we can't say whether Mycenae ruled the whole of mainland Greece. The thing is, the texts, once again, the Greek heroic tradition, leave absolutely no doubt on this subject, because the other great city known, really, the other great city of the Achaeans, is Thebes, the completely independent city he saw, which is very far north, beyond the Isthmus of Corinth, which wasn't called the Isthmus of Corinth at the time, because Corinth didn't exist, well, geographically speaking. As you can imagine, when the geographical scale was as small as I said earlier, we were dealing with two completely different entities, Thebes on the one hand, and Mycenae, Argos and Tyrrhene on the other. And Thebes is the only Achaean city to have a founding hero as illustrious as Perseus Cadmos. So you may know the story, who threw stones behind him, and these stones became men, and it was they who founded Thebes, the first population of Thebes. Well, that's obviously not historical, there were stones that turned into men, but to tell you that there's a great hero, Cadmos, who's the only equivalent to Perseus. So Thebes was truly a prestigious Achaean center, and this prestigious Achaean center for which the site appears in the Bronze Age. Bronze Age, begins around 2500 BC. With the exploitation of copper mixed with tin, you make bronze like that by mixing tin and copper. Well, I prefer metallurgy. During the first part of its history, Thebes was independent, and we have Greek heroic myths that are specific to the city of Thebes and which are totally distinct from those of the creative Argolid. This is why we can see that there are two heroic transitions that have merged together in the Greek tradition, and in particular it is independent until the death of Oedipus, who was probably the greatest king. Oedipus is the Oedipus who gave rise to Freud's Oedipus complex, etc. But above all, he was a great king of Thebes, a power roughly equivalent to that of Mycenae, Argos and Tyrrhene. And when he died, his sons, according to Greek heroic tradition, were rivals, and so his two sons are named Eteocles and Polynice. And Polynice, so Eteocles is the eldest, he's the one who reigns over Thebes, and Polynice, who is jealous of him and claims the throne, goes to Argolid for help. That is Argos according to Apollodorus, and Homer says he's going to Mycenae. But as you can see, it's always, roughly speaking, the same story from one author to the next. So Polynice, he goes to Argolid and he says, "Here, help me overthrow my brother," and that's what's called the War of the Seven Chiefs, which is led by the king of Argos, so according to Greek mythology. You know that epigone is a word that has entered our vocabulary to mean the heirs, especially intellectual heirs, of a person. We say that these are the epigones, those who continue his work. Basically, the epigones are the children of the seven chiefs who return under the direction of the same Adrastus. And this time to install the son of Polynice, who was claiming the throne, called Tersandro, on the throne of Thebes. And so what does this mean? Quite simply, if you make a little interpretation of the myth. If you make a political interpretation of the story, it's very simple. What does it mean? Maybe the names are correct, we don't know, or even slightly distorted, but in any case, there's the fact, the heart of the story you're being told, that you had two centers of power, the Argolid plain and Thebes, and that there was a war between them. At the end of these long wars, which lasted 2 generations, you're told, Thebes was vassalized by Mycenae, and with it, the Argolid triad. So there's no doubt when you read the myths that Mycenae did indeed impose itself on the whole of the Achaean world, in particular by subjugating the greatest power, its only real rival, within this Achaean world. We ask you, didn't the Minoans know bronze? Yes, the Minoans were already familiar with bronze, as I told you. It was around 2500 BC. The Minoan civilization began to appear in 2700 BC and came under Mycenaean control around 1500, so not long after. More like 1450, it seems to me. So yes, absolutely, it's a hygienic civilization of the Bronze Age. There's no need to worry. We've been in the Bronze Age since the beginning. In fact, if you like, we could say that historionomy, this first age, begins with the Bronze Age. So the last great center that remained was Pylos. And I'm not going to talk about Sparta, but Sparta is very simple. The main character we know from Sparta in the Greek heroic myths is Menelaus. And Menelaus, who is the brother of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, is himself king of Sparta. So in any case, this certainly shows that Sparta was already a vassal of Mycenae at the time. So up to here, if you like, Thebes and Sparta, from top to bottom, were subject to, and there's no doubt about it according to the myths, they were subject to Mycenae. Then there's Pylos at the bottom of the Peloponnese, and well, there too, it appears that they were conquered by the Mycenaeans, since Heracles, i.e. Hercules, whom I told you was the grandson of the king of Tyrrhente and obeyed Eurystheus, king of Mycenae, laid siege to the city of Pylos and killed King Nele of Pylos and his 11 sons. because they had attempted to steal, it is said, the cattle of the giant Geryon, which Hercules had seized in his previous work, since he had 12 labors. I think it was the 11th, the destruction of Pylos. Anyway, what's interesting, quite simply, you can see that Heracles, who was probably a Mycenaean general from the family or extended family of Eurystheus, the king of Mycenae, also took Pylos, so you can see that it's only in the case of Athens that we don't have an exact record of this, but in fact it shows quite clearly the domination established by Mycenae over the whole Achaean world, and which was not just a matter of prestige, but was truly a domination of vassalization. Mycenae was at the center of the power system, and while archaeology can't prove it, Greek heroic myths tend to, and archaeology, on the other hand, gives good clues to this, because Mycenae is the richest site we found of Mycenaean civilization. I've put some images on here that Guillaume can scroll through for you. You can see the ruins of Mycenae as they stand today, as we can see them today. This is the excavation site. You can see it in the ruins, this little opening at the bottom of the rampart, the Lion's Gate, and I've put together a reconstruction of Mycenae as it must have been. The king's palace down there, the kind of circle was probably a tomb circle, a funerary thing. Circle, a funerary thing. So was it just that, were there houses around it, perhaps built of earth or something like that, and of which no trace will ever be found, because it wasn't built in stone, so it doesn't leave any ruins? In any case, the city of Mycenae itself as it stands must have numbered 500 people at most. If you look at the size, it's really not huge. It's the size of a village with the palace in the middle always. Presumably there were perhaps a few hundred more people living around it in houses that have since been destroyed, but at the time it was a very large center and very powerful. And the city of Troy, the remains of which we have on the city of Troy, I don't plan to show you the pictures, but perhaps Guillaume will find one for you. It's about the same order of magnitude. So a very large and powerful city at the time. That's it. Well, today it's a small provincial village, but at the time it was very important. So the first stage, if you like, in the construction of this Mycenaean civilization is the domination of Mycenae over the whole Achaean world in continental Greece. If you want to find the right thing, you have to put Troy's. Well, there you have it. You can see it. The reconstructions are more or less the same. It's more or less what it looks like. It's more or less the same kind of thing. Here, hold this. And so the next stage is the gradual construction of a sort of overcoming of the simple feudal order, which ultimately put Mycenae at the head of a vassalized space with, so it takes place at the time of Agamemnon. In fact, we're 2 or 3 generations after Heracles. And that's when, before Menelaus became king of Sparta, Agamemnon marries Clytemnestra, the daughter of the king, whose name at the time was Tendar of Sparta, and has his half-sister Helen, Clytemnestra's half-sister, married to Tendar's other daughter. In fact, the 2 brothers marry the 2 sisters quite simply. If you want to cut a long story short, they marry the 2 sisters. So that's how Menelaus becomes king of Sparta. And this completes Mycenae's domination of the whole Peloponnese, and the abbot too is where Thebes is located, and it's on the occasion of this marriage, as is well known, that what's known as Tendar's oath, named after the father, the king of Sparta, is the myth that Helen is so beautiful that she wants to choose her suitor, but that Agamemnon is afraid it will start a war, and that the others, well, that's it. Guillaume shows you what the city of Troy looks like as it's reconstructed today. You see it's a citadel about the same size as Mycenae, with houses around the cities, probably made of dried ends, etc., which have now disappeared, so there's no trace of them in archaeology. But that's really the scale of the period. So, as I was saying, Agamemnon's fear was that as Helen was so beautiful, and above all, it was thought that this would give the crown of Sparta to whoever married her, so there was a great deal of greed, and he was afraid that his barons, in fact his vassals, would smack each other in the face with the one chosen by Helen. And so the solution found in the myth, but which probably evokes something true, is this oath of Tendar, by which in fact each of the candidates undertakes to protect the one chosen by Helen. To protect the one chosen by Helen, and so in reality, if you like, I think that's what's done next. And it's on this basis that the Trojan War is launched, because from the moment when Helen is kidnapped by Priam, well, it's a bit like Article 5 of NATO, i.e. an aggression against Manila is an aggression against everyone, so that's why all the Achaeans follow. But the reality, in all likelihood, is that an institutional tool was created by the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, to transform what was perhaps a loose confederation of Achaeans into a truly centralized state, with a form of primitive constitution in the form of an oath that has remained in the tradition as the Oath of Thendard, guaranteeing the rights of each of the barons, and in return demanding their submission, and which would be the equivalent, but in a rather feudalizing context, of the great documents that are generally visible in the history of civilization B, and which are at the origin of its development: the Law of the 12 Tables in Rome, the American Constitution, etc. So what you need to know is that the legend of, as I was saying, we don't have much on Athens, so I'll come back to that in fact, since we have the legend of Theseus. Domination of Mycenae over Athens. What we do have is, besides the fact, as I've already said, that archaeology shows a very clear influence of Minoan civilization on the Mycenaean and Achaean areas, the legend of Theseus in the Chronology, which can be reconstructed because the ancient authors give accounts of generations of characters, and what we see in the articulation of the myths is that Theseus is some 50 years before Agamemnon, in fact. At that time, Athens was still independent, probably from Mycenae, but under Cretan domination. And Theseus is going to free Athens from Cretan domination. This leaves us with the idea of an Achaean rebellion against Cretan rule and the expeditions. Then there's the idea of Mycenaean expeditions to Crete, including Heracles' seventh job, which is to go and steal King Minos' bull. So in reality, what probably happened at the time was that Hercules must have been a fairly important local figure, a great war leader who probably actually went to steal cattle. So either he went to steal cattle in Crete, i.e. he made radias, or perhaps he went to steal, as the bull was something considered very important in Crete, a religious symbol, etc. Perhaps by stealing the bull, they meant, on the contrary, obtaining in the opposite direction Crete's allegiance to Mycenae. In any case, what we can see is that around this time, and this fits in with the calculations we can make, roughly speaking, of generation with Greek myths, fits roughly speaking with the chronology we're re-establishing with archaeology, i.e. at this time, you have a retreat of Minoan power to the benefit of Mycenaean power, which then establishes itself, and so the following map is the Mycenaean Crete I've shown you. Here are the sites, the major sites that still exist today and continued to be relatively prosperous under Mycenaean domination, which is quite clear since we find texts written in Linear B in Crete, and so it shows that the direction of domination, if you like, had been reversed. At the same time, moreover, and this corresponds to what we see on the maps, I can put the map of please. Since that's where we're headed historically, you have, still following the chronology and heroic myths, the continuation of the adventures of the Argonauts in Colchis, which would have gone very far, Jason and the Argonauts, the search for the Golden Fleece, all that. And in the works of Heraclitus, and this is interesting, you have the first Trojan War, which we often don't hear about, but in fact there is a first Trojan War mentioned with Heraclitus. And it's very interesting because we come to the question of the Trojan War and the historicity of the Trojan War. We're pretty sure that the Trojan War took place.